All right, good evening. Welcome to the Spring 2009 California Colloquium on Water. My name is Linda Vita. I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives, and we're the main sponsor of this lecture series. I have a slide here to thank all of the sponsors who financially support the series, and I also want to particularly thank the Berkeley Water Center because they are putting on the reception before each of the lecture series. And a couple of other announcements. If you would like to receive email reminders about 2 weeks before each lecture, we have a sign-up sheet. And I'm not sure, I think, Jen is putting it in the back now. But if you are currently receiving the reminders, you don't need to sign it. You'll stay on our list. But also, if you are in the seminar class that's part of the lecture series, please make sure you do sign the list because we use that as an attendance list for the class. We also have brochures and postcards and other things about the archives, and those are in the back of the room. And a reminder that we do videotape each lecture, and we post them on our website about a week or two after each lecture. So if you know someone who was not able to be here, they can watch the lecture later. And so with that, I would like to introduce Professor Narasimhan, who is on the Colloquium Committee and also will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Linda. My name is Narasimhan, and today it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Water is such a remarkable phenomenon that in every part of the world, every single community meets its own challenges with water. Some have more water, some have less water, but all of them have problems with managing water. And all of them find creative ways of meeting the challenges. So one thing that emerges, or that has emerged in the last 10 years or so, as people around the world have been struggling to cope with water, is that we can learn from each other. Each experience gives us some clues about what is desirable, what is not desirable. And we can learn from each other to avoid each other's mistakes and learn from each other's successes. And today we have an opportunity to learn from Australia. About a year ago, I was writing some paper and I found that Australia's evaporation, transpiration losses of the total rainfall is something close to 90%. I wouldn't have believed it except that it was an official water website from the Australian government. Compared to that, California it is about 65, 67, 2/3 or so of the water annual rainfall goes off back to the atmosphere. So Australians have a very special challenges in managing water. And today, to give those experiences about Australia and for us to learn from it, we have Dr. Jennifer McKay, who is a professor of business law and a director of the Center for Comparative Water Policies and Law. It's very, very relevant, comparative water policies and law. And the University of Southern Australia in Adelaide. Dr. McKay's research interests include in the broad area of water law reforms and their impacts on communities. I mean, that says it all. At present, she is a senior fellow, Fulbright fellow, visiting UC Berkeley and the World Bank. And so it is my pleasure to invite Professor McKay to give her talk on lessons from Australia, Australia's new water law regimes. Professor McKay.
Hello. Sorry, is that okay for sound? Thank you. Thank you to everybody for the invitation. Just let me get myself into my slideshow. No. I'm, as you've heard, been very warmly welcomed here at Berkeley. I have a senior fellowship, and I've been working with the California Environmental Law and Policy at Bolt, the centre at Bolt. And we're doing some comparative work with Michael Hanneman and Richard Frank and others on looking at the Bay Delta and its management problems, and looking at how some of Australia's lessons can help California or vice versa. Now, the talk is taking a lesson from Australia's new water law regime, but I've also called it something else, just in the point that I think you should all learn a new word. I'm a lawyer, and I don't think anyone else in the room is a lawyer, but if you are, great. The word is juridification. And what I mean by that is the process that Australia has adopted is a very centralised process, which requires judges to make decisions about a lot of these very indeterminate terms, such as sustainable development. And so what Australia is launching into is a juridification process to overcome legal indeterminacy in sustainable development laws. But Australia is actually trying to do it. And many places are as well, but Australia is actually put words in laws and is making people deal with them. Now, this is an illustration of the issue of Australia's water management up to 1994, which I had done for a book that was published a few years ago by Melbourne Uni Press. The point is that Australia is a desert, as you know, and we have state borders that don't treat the country as a natural whole. I know that's not uncommon in federations. Tell me a federation that doesn't do it. Canada, and you don't do it here either. You look at the state boundaries and you think, well, that's where the natural resources that I'm interested in begin and end, so be it. Although in America you do have actually many more interstate commissions, but in Australia we don't have those. Okay, so what I'm going to do, what I spent a bit of time doing was to try and make it very real for you. I'm going to go through the water law and policy epochs that we've had, and there are 5, focusing on the very last ones, but I'm going to give you the perspective of a hypothetical farmer. What's the impact been on him of these changes? And then I'll go through the epochs. Now, we have a de facto centralised system since 2008. And the question you might want to ask is, how did we get there? And the issue will be defining sustainability in the laws that we have now produced. But we have produced a de facto centralised system. Just this poem I use quite a lot in talks. It's from 1764, and it brings up that idea of the commons. They hang the man and flog the woman that steal the goose from the common, but let the greater villain loose that steal the common from the goose. And that is the issue that we are now talking about, a commons of water and land and air, and there's a lot of other things, but I'm mainly interested in water and land, how we get those back to being treated as a common rather than these artificial political boundaries that we all love and tend to use. Here's a picture of my state, South Australia, not taken all that long ago. You can see it's dry, terribly dry and dusty. South Australia's latest crop and pasture report has confirmed the significant effect of drought, with a 25% below average yield of the 10-year average of crop production. And it's the same everywhere else, although in some parts of Queensland at the moment they will be complaining that their crops have been flooded. So, and there'd be a lot of animals dying, but in terms of cropping, there's been an overall 25% reduction below the 10-year average. If we just need to establish what water is used on in Australia, this isn't all that different, I don't think, to the US, but we irrigate pasture for cows and sheep. Irrigated sheep, one of my Danish PhD students called it, which I always use. We irrigate pasture for sheep and for cows. Then we irrigate crops, the wheat, barley and all the other sorts of things. Urban use is only 12%, industry is very small, hydro is very small, and mining and so on is very small. But we mainly irrigate crops. So the water use in Australia is about 75% on agriculture. The Bureau of Statistics have just produced the most wonderful publication where they've actually gone into some detail about this, and the figure is possibly a little bit less now, but getting figures that are accurate has often been a problem in Australia. Okay, here's some drought in the cotton in New South Wales. This cotton all died. It should have been much bigger, and I know here in San Francisco you have the same issues. So we're two very quite consonant countries in many ways, both facing drought, but Australia's is more severe, and we have acted. Oh no, I hope that doesn't happen. I hate when the slides go in. This is a tram in Melbourne. The urban people in Australia have been, even though they only use 12% of the water, which is negligible, we've all been subjected to ridiculous water saving measures. We can't water our gardens. You can water 1 day a week, before 10 in the morning in Adelaide and then after 10 at night. You can't hose down. You get fined if you hose down your pavement. Car washers have to use recycled water. It's all very honourable and has the social effect of getting everybody aware of the issue, but it doesn't really save any water. Here's a tram in Melbourne which indicates there's a big public campaign in each state about saving water. And I noticed there's quite a few here in California too. So it doesn't really save the water though, to be honest. Okay, now you have to have another little talk. This is a flowchart. We now in Australia have a number of sources of power to create laws that provide that sustainable development must be achieved. It is now the constitutional power sharing arrangements that we now have, the influence of treaties and customary international law. If I'd done this chart a year ago, it would have only been the state. The capacity to pass the laws would have only driven from state plenary power. Now with the Water Act, it derives from a much broader source of power. That is the revolution in Australia. But clearly, like California, like every province in Canada, every state has the plenary power to pass laws that require that users of water act in a sustainable way. And that shouldn't be users only of water, it should be users of land and water together. You know, we should all be sophisticated enough to be beyond the phase where we start looking at these resources individually. They're not, they're all linked together. Okay, so the legal capacity to draft water laws requiring sustainable outcomes now derives from all these sources. That's great. Everyone who's a lawyer all knows. Everyone knows of laws that are there and nobody implements them. Now that's been a bit of a problem in Australia since '94, since we've had these laws. So the problem is the institutional capacity to implement the laws. And that is often weak because of the incoherence of the institutions, the lack of water planning, the lack of skill base of the staff in the water authorities, and there's many other multiple factors. So you can have the law, but you have to have the institutions actually having money in order to implement these things. And they have money to colour trams in Melbourne with advertisements about, that costs a lot of money to cover a tram in that stuff. So there is money, but I would argue it's probably not spent in a very coordinated sort of way. So you've got the institutional capacity, and now we have legal decisions which will support the institutions. Some people see them in conflict. I see them, that a legal decision. When I presented this, I'll tell you a story, in Canberra to a group of water authority managers, of which there are about 300. There was a whole lot of them at a meeting, and I said that the form of the organisation that they're operating on is incompatible with achieving these aims, and I thought I was going to be slaughtered. After the meeting, they all came up and said, "You're right." He said, we are stymied. We've got a law here, but we can't implement it. We've got the wrong people in the wrong places, and there's a lack of coordination between us and the other one. And they went on and on. So I've got some comfort from that. So the process is you have the law, you've got to amend the institutions. The court decisions can help institutions operate because they can clarify things. And then you've still got to have the community on side. The third step is they've got to want to do this, otherwise they will fight the institutional change. And there's all sorts of issues there about engagement, perception of the issues and perception of the problem. And eventually you get a modification of the law if it's wrong. Now the modification can be to rebut sustainability or it can be to increase it. In our case in Australia, it's actually been modified to strengthen the law. So that's the framework that we're needing to analyse. Okay, let's just go very quickly. There are 5 epochs of water law in Australia. The first one is very familiar to anyone here. We had state laws only, and they were highly introspective. We had the concept of terra nullius, so our Indigenous people had considered to have no legal rights. So when the white people came, the land was just granted to them, and there were no Indigenous issues at all until 1992. And we inherited all of the wonders of English common law, such that groundwater can be taken. Whoever owns the land owns all the groundwater, Acton and Blundell, that stupid case. We inherited that like you did. And we inherited the riparian doctrine. But we changed that. Within this period, each state abolished the riparian doctrine and produced another doctrine of administrative allocation of water, a bit like they did in India. They produced these schemes so that water could be channeled in pipes to farmers away from the river, because the rivers are so small, nobody would have got enough water. So the riparian doctrine was displaced, but the groundwater doctrine remained the same. Then we had federation in 1901, and that took about 8 years of political negotiation to get the states to federate. And then we had a long period of operating between 1901 and 1983, where the states were just managing the water and the federal government was not doing very much, giving them some money every now and then, drought relief and other stuff, but not very much else. And that was because when the Constitution was negotiated, there was a Section 100 put in, which prohibited, was a prohibition on Commonwealth powers over water. The states would not federate unless Section 100 was there, and that says that there can be the power of navigation, which is a paramount national power, cannot be used to take away the state's rights to allocate water for irrigation or conservation. Because the states were aware that the federal government could use that inherent power of navigation to take away their rights to allocate water, and that was a big political power base, so they wouldn't accept it. So Section 100 was in there, and Section 100 operated, and we behaved introspectively in that period. Federal government gave some money, but nobody paid any attention to them. They did use Section 96 a bit. That's the power, and it's in the American Constitution as well, to give grants on terms. The federal government can say, we'll give you money, California, if you do X. You change the law. And they did that a bit. They did it in more other areas other than water, actually, but they did use it. Oh, that's what I've just said. So the colonial laws, the whole period from 1788 to 1901 was a development ethos. We borrowed some Americans and got them to build dams for us and do irrigation schemes, Chafee and others, and they came over to Australia, and they vice versa. Hoover came over, and we were just of the view that rain follows the plough, let's expand. And there was a focus on development on water without care for sustainable management or environmental protection. care might be a little bit of a strong word there. There were people who said that this development was inappropriate, but they were howled down. This is a cartoon from the period of Federation which shows South Australia's share of the water of the Murray, and this is Victoria. Victoria's getting a lot, South Australia's getting none. Then we had another couple of other silly little things which our constitution was based a little bit on the American Constitution. But the provision on interstate commissions was badly drafted when it was transferred over to us, and it included a judicial power which was held to be inoperable. So we could never have a powerful interstate commission like you have here. You have lots of them between the states, and they work very well. We have had none on anything because of this poor drafting. So that section of the Constitution was obliterated. So that kept the introspective focus, and I've said all that. Okay, the fiscal federalism. We had the River Murray Waters Agreement was entered into in this period, but all it did was give the states some money to build some infrastructure. So we had central power, but it had a weak influence. But over this time, people were very imaginative. This is a local version of a Persian wheel. It's called a Dethridge wheel. And these were invented in New South Wales and were the main way of working out irrigation allocations up until very recently. And they've been found to be very inaccurate, about 30% inaccurate. So people were paying for water or had an allocation of water. We didn't actually make people pay, but they had a bit of paper that said they could take X megalitres. Using this thing, they were getting X plus 30%. And this is a monument to the guy who developed it. I tell you what, if you ever want to see industrial irrigation, go to Griffith in New South Wales. It's an industrial irrigation town. It's remarkable. Okay, so what would your farmer be doing? Your farmer who came on the first fleet would have been granted land or purchased it or given a crown lease over a huge amount of land. He would have been given money to clear it of trees. He would have had subsidies to grow crops and market them. He would have had a permissive licence system. So people just gave people water. Just, you can have this much water. And the groundwater was unregulated. So your farmer was feeling pretty pleased. Towards the end of the period, meters were required in some states, and there was a varying level of enforcement. But now it's universal metering, but there were some states started metering these allocations early on. There was the magic pudding approach that the water pie can grow and rain follows the plough. And your farmers' cousins in the cities would have had water restrictions once every 5 or 6 years. That's unfortunately a bit out of focus, but that's a typical meter that is now universal. This is a Chinese meter. They cost about $3, but they're everywhere. Okay, now what was the next phase? We had a 10-year period, and this becomes very important, in 1983 to 1994, where independently of all of this, our federal government got enhanced power through interpretation of the Constitution by a couple of High Court judges. And that was in the Tasmanian Dams case. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, the famous case where the Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission, who wanted to build yet another dam in a wilderness area, a politician and a number of others fought him, and it was overturned on the basis of the treaty's power. Very legally tricky, but it worked. You still had the MDBC agreement, which was still weak, but you had ESD. We had Rio, remember? And the Australian government took it to its head to say that everyone in Australia needs to operate under these ESD principles. Produced the document, got people to sign it, but it wasn't binding, but it got on the agenda. The other thing that was incredibly important in '92 was the Mabo case, where this whole business about terra nullius was undone, and you got back to the position that the Crown has the paramount power to allocate land and water, but the Indigenous rights can coexist with that. And so you still don't have any Indigenous economic exploitation rights over water yet, but you do have rights to share land for spiritual purposes, and this will change. There's a statute now to support this. In the next 10 years, there will be Indigenous claims over economic use of water resources for spiritual and economic purposes. But at the moment, in this phase, this came in, and so you had a lot of uncertainty. Then, this is when we really started. 94 to 2007, we had state power still, but we had federal incentives, and they were much more ramped up. We had a thing called Council of Australian Government Reforms. This was Howard, who was our Republican type Prime Minister. He's just lost power. But he was operating with every state government was a Democrat type government. Labor Party, we call it, just to be confusing. And the Labor Party's red and the Liberal Party's blue. It's a complete opposite to you. But if I can get this right here, Howard created this because he was sick of the states sort of shafting him on policy reforms, not only in water, but they wanted to privatise the airports, the roads, anything that moved, they wanted to privatise. So the Council of Australian Governments reforms came in 94, and water was one of the key issues, along with privatisation of the water utilities. ESD, in ecologically sustainable development, as per the Brundtland definition, we used it, and that still was up there. And there were competition law reforms enhanced power in section 5120 and the trade practices powers. So you had enhanced federal power over water supply for businesses because we converted them from being public trust or being mutual, you would call them, mutual bodies, to businesses. And then, but at the same time, they got it into their head, we should be doing everything on a regional basis. Now, this was brilliant, but it languished for some time. And then finally, after 8 or so years of it floundering, he produced another document called the National Water Initiative, where he said, you've got to do these things. I'll give you money, but the states, and he gave a list of 80 things the states had to do, which was to harmonise their water supply policies. Okay, so the treaty's power, you've seen that now. The problem with the 94 first round of reforms were that they were too vague. They did require private sector participation and so on, and the creation of water markets. We separated the land from the water, which I don't think you've done here, but there are two separate rights now. You have a right to the land as a bit of paper, and you have a right to the water as a bit of paper, but the right is the wrong word. It's a right to the land. But for the water, it's a chance of a share of an allocation. So we separated water from land. And we did it, each state did it in 7 different ways. And in one region, there were 160 types of water rights. Nightmare. All of this detail is in the papers that I provided to the students. Okay, ESD. What is it in Australia? It mimics Rio, as I said. Decision-making processes should effectively integrate both long-term, short-term economic, environmental, social and equitable considerations. And if there is we adopted the precautionary principle, one of the few countries that did. We adopted it word for word from Rio. If there are threats of serious or irreversible environmental damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. So the perspective was that we had, in this phase, we had tighter federal government control, but still the power was with the states. At the same time, the states weren't sitting on their hands. The states were actually trying to stop farmers using too much water. And they did that through a planning process. In the famous example of over-allocation is the part of New South Wales in the Namoy region of the northern New South Wales, where when they added up all the water allocations and compared it to the proper sustainable yield, it was 1,000%. It was 10 times more water was allocated than was sustainable. And that was an accretion process and a lot of political dealings. So the states, New South Wales was slow. My state in South Australia was very good. We passed this Act in 97 and we created prescribed wells and regions, and we created water allocation plans, which had to be adopted by the minister. And these were created by the community with advice and help from the various government departments. What's happened in this particular case was that most landholders had their allocation reduced as the aquifer was over-allocated, and reduced by about 50%. Atlantis came to the court and said, this isn't fair, you know, I've had all this water, why can't I still have it? And we said, too bad. The scientists, to the best of our ability to get them to agree on something, said that you're over-allocated, and the PAV, or the permissible annual volume for this aquifer, is half what you've all got, so everybody loses half. And we said there was no provision in the water allocation plans for businesses that cannot adapt to reduced water usage, so you just had to adapt. The upshot of that was there used to be a great almond industry in that region of South Australia. There are none now. And there was a festival. It's all gone. What we've grown instead is more grapes. Whether we need more grapes or not, I don't know, but there's more grapes down there. And the later coda to that is they have done some substitution of recycled water being used from a sewage treatment plant nearby, and that's being used to replenish the aquifer, but the almond people haven't returned. Almonds are quite heavy users of water. Okay, so we just got to bear in mind that we've got two parallel processes, but the states are trying to achieve sustainability as well. And they all passed laws, and some were doing it better than others, some were not. Or some were doing it weaker. So I've said all that. Okay. And I've said that too. All right. So the COAG 94 process wanted to amend everything. The water pricing reform, these were the ideas of how the pricing should be based on consumption, should be consistent, should address environmental externalities, and cost recovery for water planning and management. And the cost recovery for water storage and delivery lower bound. So everything was on a cost recovery basis. Here are the 4 elements of sustainable development. I've been through those again. Okay, so how's your farmer feeling in this period? Very jumpy, because he sees that state power over water can be changed by the federal government. The revision of terra nullius, so that Indigenous people can share aspects of the land but no right to the water, but that still is a change. He's aware of Rio and the sustainability movement, and he sees the state water planning processes uphold reductions of water. There was one case called Ashbourne's case in Victoria where the farmer, the Victorian government passed a law very clear that said if you have a dam, you have to have a licence for the amount of water in the dam. And you can't put the dam so that you capture all the water and the guy down the road doesn't get any. You can only capture 50%. There was a guy called Ashbourne who'd had about 8 dams and they were all in the wrong spot. He went to the court and said the act's invalid. And the court, of course, said, no, the act is valid, and he had to change. So the state courts were very strict on enforcing the laws when the states passed them. Okay, so what's happening to the farmer? He's having his water supplied and allocated now by a different body, because we've corporatised. And this body has different obligations, one of which is to achieve ESD, whereas the body in the past was only interested in getting the water to you and maybe getting rid of your waste. He would not get any compensation for lost allocations, that was clear. And the prospect was that the process for allocation in the future was going to be a share of the pool of water in an aquifer, and the same for a surface water source. Rather than getting a fixed bit of paper that said you can have X megalitres, all of the Commonwealth was leading the states to a position where people get a share of the consumptive pool, and that's worked out on an annual basis. So that puts all the risk on the farmer. And water markets meant that water could be traded out of the region. And again, very famous case. Murrumbidgee Irrigation refused to let water be traded out of the region, and they were taken to court by the Trade Practices Act, and they were ordered to do it because it's a breach of competition law. So you've got, but your farmer is seeing all of this and getting obviously very anxious. Okay, so let's see what's happened. We've got these water supply businesses now because we've privatised. So in 2007, we found that New South Wales had 79 water supply businesses, but they were in 9 different types. Queensland had 115, but only 7 types. Tasmania, which is tiny, Tasmania is very small, had 32 water supply businesses, 6 types. Western Australia, which is about 3 times the size of California, had 22. Victoria had 24, and the Northern Territory and the territories had 1. So we've got still a lot of water supply businesses, and they're all different legal forms. 14 different legal types, and some are totally private, whereas others are corporations or government owned. And it's all in the papers that I supplied to the poor people who have to read it. So we did a project for the CRC for Irrigation Futures, which is a cooperative research centre that I'm in, and we interviewed the chief executive officers of the major water supply businesses, did a mega interview with them, and did it with a professional market research group in my university who happened to be in the same division. So these were very well handled data. We asked them, this is the CEO, are they able to achieve sustainable water management? In this graph, 5 is neutral. So you can see not many of them are saying yes. The guy in Canberra can, but Canberra's very small. But most of the others are not confident that they can achieve sustainable water management. This is by state, and this is by the type of organisation. There is a huge amount of trust between this organisation and the state government. The answers to that were pretty negative as well. New South Wales, not a lot of trust. These figures are the range, this is the mean. Northern Territory, again, one body, it trusts its government, but it's a one company town. Queensland with 115, again, right in the middle. Victoria, much higher, because Victoria's water system is well organised and consonant. Each of the 24 water supply businesses are in the same legal form as the others. Victoria is much better at all of this than anyone else. And WA all over the place. So they don't trust each other, they don't think they can achieve it, they don't think the state government policy-making processes follow a predictable pattern either. Hard work if you're a CEO. We also asked them about the ESD principles. How much work had they put into achieving them, and what did they think was the most difficult? The degree of effort, they put the most into community involvement, cost effectiveness, and decision-making, trying to engage the community. But they thought the most difficult to achieve were the global dimension and the scientific certainty and the diverse economy. In other words, they weren't sure how to do this, but they knew about it, and they knew they had to do it. Okay, so up until 2007, that was the position. Then the past government, Howard, the Liberal Republican guy, he made an announcement, and he didn't actually even consult many of his public servants. On Australia Day in 2007, he said, we're going to pass a Water Act, and we're going to try and pass it under federal power and get you guys to work together because we'll force you to do it. He wanted some referral of powers as well, but he did it that way. And then what happened was he lost power, and it went into abeyance for a while, but now, since then, the federal government has changed, and in fact, the present Water Act, the Water Act has been passed, the states have referred powers, and the power the federal government has in fact been strengthened. So you had an advocacy coalition in this second phase, because they're all the same political persuasion. But it was Howard who actually passed it out of frustration. So this is in fact the third way of enhancing central power in our federation, is to get a referral of power and to use expanded powers in your constitution to take over an area from the state. What were the drivers? Other drivers on this were international pressures and treaties. We've signed all the treaties. We hadn't signed Kyoto until recently, but we had signed all the others. Internal issues such as blue-green algae and the algal bloom in the Murray. There was one episode where the Murray went green and the Darling went green, and that was very noticeable. Loss of community support for dams, the need for full cost recovery for infrastructure. So, what are the facets of this new epoch? We've got ecologically sustainable development embedded in the law, and we now have the states having to they were trying to do it, but now they have to do it. We have increased participation at all levels by the private sector and public. The reforms require a mix of bottom-up and top-down approaches, and the mechanism to achieve this is the communities draft water sharing plans. But of course, this has come with increased complexity in the institutional structures. Just to prove to you that the word sustainability is used in the field, this is the Lower Murray, there it is. Telling the community that the government, they're all doing this to achieve better health, efficient water use and sustainable floodplain farming. So it's everywhere. We have spent a lot of money on infrastructure. This is solar plumes in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, which was a big scheme, and that cost millions. It's all done remotely, the water sharing. It's a fantastic scheme. But still, people are fighting. Growers steal the Murray water to save the crops. So the bloody irrigators got me again last night. This is a paddle steamer on the Murray. Okay, what has been the community reaction to this enhanced water regulation? There's been a general increase in water theft in all jurisdictions, especially in relation to water users, as well as vociferous opposition to water shortages. We can't get exact figures on that, but that's the best I can do at the moment. So now the Commonwealth has this brand new act, and it says it has the power to accredit states-based water plans. And the state-based water plans must aim to achieve ESD. So if one of the states tried to have a water plan without the words environmentally sustainable development in the water plan, that wouldn't be accredited. It gives a role to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to regulate process and creates the Commonwealth as an environmental water holder. The Commonwealth will now be buying water from farmers or getting donations of water and be buying water and land, and we've already done that. We've bought back some land and water from some of the big farming properties in Western New South Wales. So what are the issues with this Act? Is it valid? There are new administrative arrangements. We've got justiciability now of just about everything. We have a basin plan. The accreditation and adoption of state plans is an issue, and you have the concept of sustainable development. This is another way of expressing it, the complexity of it all. Okay, now, what are the terms of this Act? It says that the purpose of this Act is to manage water in the national interest and in accordance with relevant international agreements. It lists all the relevant international agreements, and it includes everything. The one about migratory birds, the Ramsar, everything. And Kyoto would be in there now because there's so it very much broadens the power. And subject to the above, which is peculiar, to promote the use management of basin water resources to optimise economic, social and environmental outcomes, which is the same as saying EST. But it is, at the present time, the best you could say about it is it's indeterminate. The Ramsar Convention uses the term urgent national interest. Would judges now use this as a guide to defining national interest? I'm sure they would in Australia. So here's our 56 NRM regions, and I've had them reproduced with the state borders, but I didn't need to do that. But if you look carefully at them, you'll see they are still state-based. There's one in Queensland. The Clondamine goes down there. At present, the NRM regions are still state-based. Natural Resource Management regions. These are the regions over which people have to plan. and the Commonwealth accredits the plans. The state makes the plan, the Commonwealth accredits it, and then development can go on. But the regions are still state-based. So the next phase will be to see the reality of those regions geophysically represented on the map, so that if it happens to go between Queensland and New South Wales, then it does. It's not two separate regions. The Murrumbidgee, for example, this is the region, this is one of the major rivers. This is the Murray, this is the Murrumbidgee in New South Wales. Here's a list of all the different organisations in it. Canberra is there, but there's something like 14 different organisations within that natural resource management region, all supplying water. So we talked to the farmers in a study about the water plans and asked, we had a sample of them from Victoria and New South Wales, and you can see the participation rates weren't great in the allocation plans, only 16 and 31%. Did they trust the water supply business? Very low level of trust. What did they think of the admin procedures? They're a bit more positive on that. Were they informed about the reforms? Not well informed. Did they feel they were treated fairly? Again, it varies. So there's quite a lot of resistance about this concept. So how does the process work? It works in a similar way in each state. You have a state produce its central NRM plan, and then it devolves to regional NRM groups to produce plans, and involves all of these people in the production of them. The consultation process varies, and that's something that the new Act will fix. It will get a much more harmonised approach. At the moment, they're all a bit all over the place. And finally, if the federal government feels that the state has not done the water plan in an adequate way for a basin state, which is the Murray Basin, then it will step in and produce the basin plan. So that is a very unusual provision. So the issues are, we have existence of legal regulation here now. We have multiple layers of legal regulation over very indeterminate terms, using indeterminate terms like sustainability and all those other things I said to achieve balance in social, equitable, economic. None of that is defined. The normal the normal attitude to the law is that you need to have determinacy of the law so people know what their legal obligations are. But at the moment, you could only say sustainable development is only moderately determinate, which is the reason why there are quite a bit of public debate about the issue. So, there are two types of indeterminacy in this Act. There's the one that's solvable, which is about the words. Just like that Irlandes case, the one about the almonds, they solved the problem there with the understanding of the words. Eventually there will be an understanding of the concept of sustainability or how people should look at the hierarchy of interests in cases. The second type, which is a bit harder, is the rules within open-ended plans. And remember, the whole thing is premised on the community creates a plan, and then the plan gets accredited, and then the federal government will give the states some money to implement the plan. But if the plans aren't written very well, that'll make it very difficult. And in fact, in South Australia, we've had a number of problems with the plans. But what else is going on as a side issue? In Victoria, I came across this the other day, the Victorian Racing Club, which is where the Melbourne Cup is run, Flemington Racecourse. Any of you seen the Melbourne Cup on TV? Anyway, they're a very big water user because they're irrigating turf. They have now decided that they're going to pay somebody else to save water so that it can use the water for the racecourse. Now that's still perfectly legal because there isn't a plan that covers Melbourne that makes that illegal yet, or even has anything to say about it. This is just going on now. And the equity issue that was raised would result in some communities that are financially very well off being able to get around water restrictions. You might want to argue that a race course is not a particularly highly moral way of using precious water, but anyway, that's what's going on at the moment. And Sydney Water is going around giving lots of money to people, to small businesses, to retrofit things. I don't know how long they will do that, but they're the only one doing that. So, what's the problem in the end? We've had some plans accredited, but they were accredited just as they were in order to get the Act to operate. There hasn't really been a proper accreditation process. But the rules are up for accreditation, and so this creates another set of rules that the states have to actually think about before they can draft their plan. And so each plan has to cover the full range of NRM issues. The arguments on that just could go on and on forever. Be underpinned by a scientific analysis of natural resource conditions, problems and priorities. Effectively involve all key stakeholders in plan development and implementation. Some of those are quite easy to point the finger at and say that's inappropriate, and others would be harder. So the water plans are required, as I said before, and no one will get any compensation for changes in reductions unless there's a policy change. And the NRM planning process says, we want to support the wetland in this area now. Rather than grow grapes, we want to support the wetland. So the grape growers, if they lost water, would get compensation, because that's been a change of policy. But if the scientists come up with the view that the PAV is 50% of what they thought it was, nobody will get any compensation. There's another better photo of a meter. So we have some judges who are working towards developing and seizing the opportunity to work on the law of sustainable development. And that's a judge in New South Wales. But at the moment he's on his own because we haven't got any further decisions. So this is now the new ministerial arrangements we have in Australia, which is radically different. We have the Commonwealth Minister who makes plans. We have all of these, the authority, there's going to be a Murray-Darling Basin authority created out of expert individuals to be the minister negotiates with, but the authority actually produces the plan, but of course in practice is there as a third party to oversee the production of the plans by state governments and their compliance with the Act. And then the Ministerial Council and there's a Basin Officials Committee will all be involved in the whole process. And you'll have a Ministerial Council. But that will only be advisory, but the Commonwealth Minister will have the actual power. Now that's a complete change. It would have been last year just the state. Okay, so how do we optimise environmental outcomes? That's defined as ecosystem function, biodiversity, water quality and water resource health, and to improve the water security for all users of the basin. And they're using the Biodiversity Convention definition there. So how's your farmer feeling now? He's now got the state and the Commonwealth government to deal with, which he would think is a nightmare. In a water plan area, he must engage with his neighbours to achieve sustainable water use, rather than behaving individually. He has the entire risk on himself. The water plans and the allocations will be determined, under the water plan, the allocations will be determined each year. So he'll only know at the beginning of the water year, which is May or varies according to the season, how much water he's going to have. If you've got permanent plantings, that's a real problem. If you've got non-permanent plantings, that's easier to manage with. So you could see there would be a pressure to move towards non-permanent plantings, which could destroy our grape industry. And he's seen new water rights evolve, apparently out of nowhere. So that was really just my summary at the local level. I'd just like to acknowledge all the people who've helped me with this as a result of work over a number of years, and the Fulbright Foundation as well for my senior Fulbright. And I would just like to remember the victims of the bushfires in Victoria, which were partly a consequence of drought and dryness, and the 700 houses and 2,000 people affected directly, apart from the 180 that have died. But my ex-PhD supervisor sent me that. I thought it was a light note to finish on. CFA is the Country Fire Authority. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Half hour for discussion. Please feel free to ask.
Please let me get the microphone for you before you ask your question.
Well, since you're a Australian, I'll use an English expression that no one else probably understands, but you will. I'm gobsmacked. That means surprised in England, that how complicated it is. Do you have the same degree of chaos with respect to water quality regulations?
Water quality is now being regulated at a federal level. It's been used, they've used guidelines for many years. There are Australian water quality guidelines produced federally, but the states have been much more willing to adopt them rather than fight them, because it's so the water quality is a parallel process, but the states all tend to look to the federal ones, which have been produced by a long time.
So it's a little better.
It's a little better, yeah, but some states still use the WHO guidelines and there's two of them, 97 and some other than some, yeah. But mostly there's a movement towards, particularly for recycled water, there's much more harmony on that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. It was a very interesting talk. I come from the European Commission. I'm here also as a visiting fellow.
Oh, good.
I see some similarities in what you're doing with our Water Framework Directive.
Yes.
I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but picking up on the last question, our approach is an integrated approach where we're trying to manage quantity and quality as two sides of the same coin, because the issues that we face are, for ecological uses, for example, it's not just the volume of water, it's quality. You talked about eutrophication problems, et cetera, et cetera. So managing one and ignoring the other at the same time is problematic. My question, however, is I saw in your presentation a number of references to full cost recovery and other fiscal type elements. Clearly, in our context, in Europe, one of our problems with water use is that many users, and farmers in particular, don't pay anything significant at all for water.
True. Yes.
How important is that starting to be in an Australian context in terms of rationing water other than just by allocations?
Well, we've got the people who have the water allocations from the past, when they were permissive, have now had them often reduced in volume, but they didn't pay for them, and sometimes they have passed them on to their family. But if you wanted to get water now, you'd have to buy it. So you've got a bit of a dual system. You've got people who've inherited it, but have had their quantum reduced, and you've got people who want more. They will buy it from these people who want to sell it. The idea being that the people who want to sell it can stay on the land, but the water can go somewhere else. So yes, the whole thing about full cost recovery was essential to the 94 process to get full cost recovery for infrastructure, mainly in the urban areas. We don't have that many of these irrigation schemes like the one I showed you with the flumes. There are some, but most farmers are on their own, just getting water out of an aquifer or pumping it out of a river with their own infrastructure. But for the urban environments, full cost recovery was crucial. And the other point is with farmers, the issue for water quality is an urban issue. For farmers, they pump up whatever they can get, and if there's a problem with their crop, there's nobody supplying it. It's raw water in the raw water, true sense of the word. So the water quality issue is an urban issue. But the exception to that, of course, is if you are using recycled water, like that slide, this here. This is all recycled water in Australia, and I think most of the world uses these lilac pipes, and the quality standards for that are rigorously enforced if they're used in agriculture. And it's mainly used in agriculture and in some places to flush toilets and so on.
What about upstream salination for downstream users? It makes the water unsuitable for cultivation.
What, of recycled water?
No, just regular river.
Well, that salination is a huge problem. Down the Murray, in lots of parts of the Murray, the land is unable to be used. It's so salinised. But they're not. They haven't got a solution. Well, there's a structural solution in part to that, which is being done on the Murray. But these policies are all about quantum and allocations and markets. But for the urban area, it's about quality.
Thanks for your talk, Professor McKay. As someone who has worked firsthand on NRM policies, particularly from a New South Welsh perspective, and am now working on the Commonwealth Water Act, you may remember in the mid-90s we had this notion of TCM, Total Catchment Management, and all of our NRM, Natural Resource Plans, had three elements. It was about land, it was about water, and it was about biodiversity. Are we now facing a paradox whereby with the Commonwealth Water Act, which only mentions water, there are no biodiversity elements at all? In fact, they are deliberate exclusions from the Commonwealth Water Act. Are we now facing a paradox whereby we've got a divergence of legislation concerning land and water, and will that make it in fact more difficult to achieve our noble 1990s goal of integrated catchment management, incorporating the land and the water and the biodiversity?
Well, they have put in biodiversity in that last provision. The one I see, they have put it in. I've thought about integrated catchment management for many years. It is, I think, politically very difficult to achieve. This is just at a macro level. It's also difficult to achieve. It's no better. I think it's just difficult to achieve, and what we need is some guidance and some restrictions or some understandings of the terms. So I don't know the answer to that. My feeling of talking to public servants in various states is that I think there's a huge amount of goodwill and a huge amount of effort being put into things, which has often not been fully appreciated or fully even spread to Sydney. What they're doing in one part of New South Wales hasn't got to Sydney. It's better in South Australia because it's smaller in a sense. It's bigger in land, but it's smaller because there's fewer areas that are settled. And so I think we're in a sort of ennui phase of things. People got ESD in their head, but how to achieve it, and all this process will drive possibly some more administrative guidelines, which might help everybody. But it would be a shame if some of the good work was lost. There are some very good examples of individuals and communities getting together and doing good things in small regions.
Two questions about the reallocation. If before it was a fixed allocation of water and now it's a shared allocation, how do you get the share? How do you determine as among the people who share in the use of water?
Yes.
And then how does that affect the pricing and the marketing? Have the prices of water generally gone up quite substantially through this system?
Well, yeah, to the share, they got all the bits of paper that presented the allocation and put that on the bottom axis, and then they got whatever you had, and that became the percentage.
So it's a share based on historic use
Yes.
that you can prove?
Yes.
It's like an adjudication in California?
Yes. It's based on historic allocation, not on historic use. That's a good point. The use would only come up if you were saying you'd used more than you were allocated, and then you would be breaching the law. So that's how the percentages work. The question on the price of water. The price of water for farmers, it goes all over the place. Most of the market transfers, how we've said there's a market now, have all been in the temporary. 90% have been temporary, very few permanent transfers. And the price is all over the place. It just reflects what the weather and the date of the announcement. But there's no doubt some people have made a lot of money and some people have lost a lot of money.
Well, given the fact that it's an allocation of the available pool,
yes,
which is determined on an annual basis,
yes,
I don't see how you could have a long-term permanent transfer of a water right, because that long-term transfer is inherently variable with annual conditions. So it seems like your point of, this is a scheme for moving water out of the irrigated side and into the urban side where they can pay for it.
Well, yes, except that the risk is now clearly on whoever owns the water, but you can sell that risk. You can sell for 5 years to this guy that he has the same as you, and so he can't get any better than you. So that's what is being sold, but most of them are annual or up to 3 to 4 year transfers. Very few permanent. Yeah, and the buying of urban country towns are taking advantage and buying water from the farmers nearby, but that doesn't apply to most farmers. Most farmers are too far out.
I'm interested, now that you've spent some time in California, what lessons would you recommend that we draw from Australia's experience to apply here in California?
Well, that's a good, the more I'm here, the more I realise how complicated it is. So I'm a bit loath. I do like your groundwater decision, Katz against somebody. Yes, who said that you've got to consider other users. That was in 1902, so it's a pity we didn't have that. So I would recommend, but we've achieved something similar to that now because groundwater is incorporated in all these plans and it must, again, achieve the sustainability. So that would have been good. I don't know whether that has actually made your groundwater management sustainable or not. I've got a feeling it hasn't. But the other thing that interests me about California is the adjudication process. We have a court system to hear complaints about the plans and so on, and it's more, ours seems to be more macro scale. Would be better for California to be able to create something that deals with a multitude of cases in one shot rather than individual, but I'm going to think about that some more. It's very confusing here. Complicated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You brought up this term juridification. Yeah. And of course, as a political scientist, it comes immediately up the question, what about the democratic legitimacy of such a juridification? Because judges are not elected. So I think if very many decisions go to the courts, this is a problem for a democracy. The other question I would be interested also, I can see this here in California, I'm coming from Germany, you showed this train or tram where they had this photo on, this painting, and you said, well, has not any consequences, really. Has this to do with political culture? Because this you also can see here, wherever you go to the Hearst Gymnasium of Women for Swimming, you have everywhere, please pay attention, use of water and so on. But it pours out so much water, you can't imagine. So I think it's really what you said, you can find it everywhere, but why is it? Because people don't really care, everybody knows this, or is it a question of political culture? And the last question would be about the impact of these international treaties. You mentioned that quite often in your talk. Do you think it's just, on the paper, saying this treaty, this treaty, this treaty, or does it have impact?
Well, to answer the last one first, now it is clearly in our law. We've had the treaties at the side. Now we have put them into the law. So it will have a monumental impact and allow judicial widening of concepts. That'll be monumental. But no one's done anything on it yet because we haven't had any cases. The thing about putting advertisements on trams about water saving, there have been a number of people prosecuted in Australia for watering their garden at the wrong time. So, and they get written up in the paper. I think generally, I don't know what people's attitude to the tram and other public information. You could do an interesting study on that as social scientist or behavioural scientist, but certainly it's seen in Australia as the urban community bearing the same pain as some of the farming community. So that's why there's the water restrictions, and that's promoted through that mechanism.
I have a
Yes?
couple of questions. It is becoming very clear from a scientific perspective that water has to be managed based on the nature of its occurrence, which constitutes the science part of it.
Yes.
Which includes not only the water quality, the land and the animals and everything. And scientists have to be humble, just like you use the word indeterminate. When dealing with nature, there are a lot of indeterminate things in science.
Well,
So science can give some assessment as to what might happen. We have to learn to adapt. That is the dominant theme. Now, what I find is that most of the discussions that are presented based on law or policy or science, the boxes are all filled with various kinds of councils and other things. There is very little mentioned about a formal role for science in the entire process, where science actively feeds into the policy and the law part of it.
Well, the plans...
And let me just finish this. So it's very clear that science cannot make policy. But it's also clear that policy cannot exist without science.
That's right.
Because policy has to be wrapped around the realities of scientific knowledge of the system. So I believe that there must be some way in the various administrative processes that go on in policy making and law making, that science has a formally recognized place so that science and scientific information is actively sought after and given. And in that light, I have a second very broad question. Has there been any constitutional declaration in the Australian Constitution about the nature and the importance of science, about water, and how it should be handled?
I get your point. Science is inherent in the creation of the plans. The plans must be made. I gave you the list of, somewhere in here is the list of things that they have to follow. So the plan has to be shown to be based on scientific knowledge. Then the question is, and you get 4 hydrologists in a room and you get 4 different answers, which is fine because it's not a perfect science. But the precautionary principle then comes in. And as long as the adjudicator can say, the scientists are telling us it's murky, but it's uncertain, therefore we should make a decision that protects the environment. It doesn't discount the science. It in fact takes the science at its highest in terms of it being uncertain or showing that there are potential damaging effects and make a decision that doesn't cause any further damage. And the precautionary principle, that's what that's called, and that's been applied quite regularly in decisions.
I'm going much deeper than that. I'm going about, for example, when you showed that management regions, for example, here in this country, in many of Kansas and Nebraska and other places, they are going for watershed management and basin management. So they need scientific institutions which are vested with the responsibility of continuous monitoring.
And our friend from the BOW...
Yeah, and I think there has to be, right now, if you stand back and look at it, when it comes to a question of monitoring, for example, there are not many agencies who are willing to come up with money for long-term monitoring.
Australia, as part of this Act, has got the Bureau of Meteorology to consolidate all the data.
So my point is that we have to have, just like we have these many boxes in administration, there must be some way that scientific knowledge is formally incorporated into the process.
Well, it is. It's here, see? Scientific, they must show that it's underpinned by scientific analysis. And if they don't, then it won't be accepted and it will be redone.
I'm not so sure that it answers my question for the need for science to be an integral part of policy making. I'm not very sure about that.
Well, this gets as close as you're going to get as a clear statement anywhere. And I agree with you. I know. This is the problem I work on with the CRC people.
Because there's also the question of long-term changes in this. These are all dynamic systems.
Yes.
And so one question rightly was brought up was that we cannot make water rights allocation in perpetuity anymore. You cannot give water trading rights in perpetuity anymore.
Well, but no, and in fact the community has reacted by only transferring temporarily.
So the scientific reality has to be, and then the third part of it, of course, is the education and outreach part of it, which in this country, in many places, you take Santa Clara Valley Water District, this education is an integral part of it. Everybody gets involved. So to some extent, education and outreach is also extremely important.
Well, I think, yes, I think the process will drive an educative process.
My question is about accreditation, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Is the accreditation from a third-party body who evaluates the plan, either the NRM plans, I assume, and is that the hook that the federal side has on the states? In other words, if they put forth a weak plan and it's not accredited properly, then they have the option of then taking over the process. Is that how that works? And who are the bodies that accredit, and is there an appeal process? And talk about that in general.
There will be. At the moment, all you've got is the provision saying that the states must submit their plans to the Commonwealth, and they'll be accredited by the relevant government departments' officials. These are the test. If there was an issue on this, it would have to go to a court to be adjudicated. The state would say, we've done an adequate science, and the Commonwealth would say, no, you haven't. And so it would go, and the question of where that would go is a bit up in the air at the moment. It's not stated in the Act, but it doesn't need to be stated in the Act. This is now a federal Act, so it should perhaps go to the High Court or maybe to the federal court. So it would be an administrative law, and that's what I mean by we'll start getting determinacy once we get a number of these issues being ironed out. So then there'll be a decision about what is adequate scientific analysis in a case of an aquifer or something.
Do other citizens have standing to appeal these accreditations?
No. We don't have such a well-established third-party system as you, although a good lawyer will hunt around and find a treaty or something. That's all yet to evolve. And the Tasmanian Dams case was taken by a group of private citizens, and Marbo was a private citizen. So that's all yet to evolve.
I wanted to press you on the same question that the lady in the red asked. About lessons for California or the state here. So given that it is complex here, and given that you're not as familiar with this system, but maybe you could use your lack of familiarity with it as a, to give you more insight if you were to start from scratch more, and some of the things that are lessons that you could draw directly from Australia that that we should be doing here better. I mean, how do you think that this juridification is something that we should be doing here, or?
Well, your system is very much more litigious, individual litigious. I would like to see. I'm a bit. It's a bit difficult for me to say this because I'm just not sure, really. All I've discovered is that from the time I've been here, how complicated it all is. So, I mean, it would be handy if you had the precautionary principle in the state statute. That would help the scientists. That would be really handy. I don't think it's in the number of statutes that govern all the bodies, or the Water Resources Commission and so on. So I don't think that's in there. That would be handy, and it probably would be handy to not have the silly prior appropriation doctrine as well. but you're never going to unpick that. That's the only thing that will never be unpicked. And it does seem to work to some extent to create, in the senior and the junior right holders, does seem to create a sense of priority and sustainability. Like the junior people lose it and the senior people get it. That does seem to be a bit unfair. In our system, everybody would lose 50%, which might also be silly, but at least it's more equitable. But given you're not going to unpick the prior appropriation doctrine, I would think putting the precautionary principle in would probably be the thing I would suggest.
Should we federalise the way that Australia has?
Well, Australia's done it. We're different to you, and we've done it in this way, as I've explained, through a set of... I don't think it would ever happen here. But I don't think that the federal government should not... I think it should give perhaps more guidance on some standards. I mean, some of the water quality standards here vary according to the size of the town. I mean, I find that to be quite inequitable. Just because you're in a small town, you'll have to tolerate more of some things than they should be more equitable, no matter what size of the town. So if I was the federal government, I would have thought it would have been a good idea to try and get some things harmonised. But having said that, and having lived in America for a little while now, that's a very difficult challenge to even get, because it's so diverse and so complicated.
So as I understand it, you've had sustainability in the water planning process for a few years now in terms of defining the available water pool.
Varying in the different states. Now it's more uniform.
Could you talk a little bit about, just maybe historically or based on your experience on the states, how they've actually applied that?
Well, the example I gave was the Irlandese, the case where the aquifer was determined to be over-allocated, and so everybody lost half. And there's been other cases like that as well, where the scientists get into court, and we have the minister, somebody on this side who's refused water. The minister says we've refused it because the scientists tell us it's over-allocated, and everybody loses water.
And in terms of how it's being weighed against other interests and determining the actual pool of available water?
The problem is the sustainability's got the three heads: economic, social, and environmental. They're the three heads. The definition. It's all of them. And I gave it here the full. And that judge that I quoted earlier said, we will have to develop a jurisprudence to work out the hierarchy of these things. And we're mandatory in the International Court of Justice in the only case that's dealt on this, the Slovakia against Hungary. It's two names I can't pronounce, but he said the same. You've got to get, in each case, you've got those three pillars, you've got to work out the balance. And temporarily, maybe for the next 10 years, that the plan has to work this way. And yet nobody's really done that in the water environment. All we've done is, in the state level, in some cases, we have enforced laws that have reduced allocations on the broad head of sustainability. And we've destroyed, in that Irlandese case, the almonds case, they destroyed the almond industry. So obviously environmental sustainability, you'd rank as much higher in that case than economic or social. It was a clear choice. We can't have everything, so with the environment, so we've only got a few cases like that. They're all over the place. And so we need to develop a better set of decisions to try and give some understanding to this inherently indeterminate concept.
Could I ask you a question on that? Because when you talk about sharing the water and you're cutting back the water availability to farmers, say, by 50%,
yes.
Is that because you've defined minimum flow rates for rivers, for ecological conditions,
yes.
or other factors like that?
Yes.
Is the percentage share of the different interests changing according to the rainfall or whatever?
Well, in that case, the past practice had over-allocated the aquifer. And then the new laws came in, and the scientists went back and said, this is the permissible annual volume. We did revise the Australian rainfall and runoff calculate. We revised it down from the stuff they were using 10 years ago. So that provoked a bit of a change in lots of these, because suddenly the standard became different. And so they just said, we've now, on the best available scientific evidence, we think this is the amount of water you should take from this aquifer. You're taking double that, everybody loses 50%. So that was an ad hoc decision. And in the case of that other river I told you, there was 1,000%. Everybody just lost, everyone got 10%.
Coming to the top of the hour, so we'll take one more question. That was one.
I just wanted to say that the notion of making the allocation change year by year is really the strongest acceptance of sustainability in this this legal structure.
Yes, but it hasn't been fully implemented. That's been a notion on the table since the NWI in 2004, and that's when the Commonwealth had no real power. And it's embedded, of course, into this new Act, and I think only one region in Australia has actually implemented it. But they all have to, but that is a very key component of it, yes.
Is it possible for the government to purchase an allocation after the total allocation has been defined, and then to compensate the holders of the allocation for wildlife purposes? So to actually give biodiversity purchase allocations for the
Commonwealth can clearly do that.
Of a region.
The Commonwealth can buy, it's done it. It's bought land and water up in northern New South Wales for that purpose. Then it would have to buy the land and water from the person, because it's changing the policy. It's saying we want to preserve this wetland now rather than continue to degrade it. So they would have to give them compensation. If in the other case they just say everybody can do everybody has to do what they like, but they can only have 50% of the water, you wouldn't get any compensation for that loss. Water has never been a right in Australia. It's always been a licence, and that's been the misunderstanding. And it's still only a licence, but now the terms will be a share of the consumptive pool.
Was there one more question behind there? That's the last question.
It's a very related question, is how stable and rigorous is this structure if the drought keeps getting worse and worse? What are the impacts likely to be?
Well, this grew out of the drought, really. This last phase of having the Commonwealth pass this Act grew out of Howard's frustration with the states not performing under his NWI. It will only strengthen it, I think. And in fact, I mean, in Queensland at the moment there are floods. This Act would apply to that as well. I mean, it should be able to apply to, or the processes should apply to management of resources generally.
Well, that has been a very informative and educational talk. Thank you very much.